So this is our first demo where we are setting up Salesforce as service provider and another Salesforce as identity provider. So whatever we have learned so far, like basically we gathered that what information we require from identity provider, what information we require from service provider. So here we will first going to set up all these in our Salesforce org and find out that how we get that information that we have discussed. So first of all, like I've mentioned, we're going to set up the identity provider Salesforce org. So before I start and just implement this, first of all, you need to create two Salesforce orgs for this demo to be implemented your side. So just create two orgs. One is for identity provider and another one is for service provider, and also enable my domain at both the orgs, right? So this is something which is prerequisite to this demo. So once you are done with that, then you can definitely go and start this session. So the first step while setting up the identity provider is that you need to enable the organization as an identity provider. The second step is you need to integrate the service provider as a Saml enabled connected app. So these are the two steps involved while you are setting identity provider Salesforce organization. And on the other hand, we have service provider Salesforce organization. And to set up a Salesforce provider Salesforce organization, first of all, we need to enable the organization for SAML. So we need to enable this in our settings. The second step is integrate the identity provider in single sign-on settings. So this is our second step involved in this. And the third one is enable the authentication from my domain. So my domain settings will going to allow you that you can have that settings to enable the authentication, like whatever the authentication you have applied for a identity provider, you can set up that from your my domain. So let's quickly jump to the orgs. Yeah. So I have one org which is behaving as an identity provider and the another one as service provider. So I have set up these two orgs to perform this demo. So as an identity provider, what I need to do is, first of all, I need to enable the identity provider settings. So in this setup, I'll just have to write identity, and I have this identity provider. So here you can see that we have a button, enable identity provider. So you just need to click this. So choose the certificate that Salesforce.com uses when communicating with service providers. So this is really important, and you just need to save this. All right. So now, as you can see here, that first of all, you get the issuer ID, which is this. And if you remember, this is something that you require from an identity provider while you are setting up the service provider. So we get that issuer ID here. Also, if you notice, we have a certificate as well that we have just saved before enabling the identity provider. So you can say that we have issuer ID, we have a certificate. Now, I think if you remember, the third requirement is the assertion parameter type. And that we will going to set up while we will set the connected app for the identity provider, which will going to integrate the identity provider with the service provider. So what we will going to do is we first download this metadata file. All right. Now, before moving to the connected app, because in connected app, we require information from service side as well. So I'll go to this service provider org. First of all, I need to enable this as a service provider. So my first step is to enable the app for Saml. So just need to edit this. That's it. So now as you can see that this organization is now working with Saml enabled. Now just below this, we have Saml single sign-on settings, which is used to configure the identity provider. We have several ways. The first one is like we can manually enter every information like the name, the issuer ID, the identity provider certificate, the entity ID, the certificate, the request signing certificate, request signature method, assertion decryption certificate, and many more information that it's required. Or the other way is that we can go to the new from metadata file and we can choose the metadata file that we have downloaded from the identity provider. So I'll just go choose one. Just go, this is this, and click on create. Once you create this, you can see that we have the certificate here. We have the entity ID. We have the issuer ID, right? So these information is something that it automatically get from the metadata file. Identity provider, single logout URL. So like I'll just give this a name as identity provider org. Also, if you notice here that we have two parameters requirement, if you remember, one is Saml identity type and the another one is Saml identity location. So for Salesforce, we should set this for the federation ID. This is something that Salesforce usually use for single sign-on. And for the location, it is something that will be mentioned in the name identifier element of the subject element. Also, we will going to discuss the other parameters as well, like if it is something that is mentioned in the attribute element of the assertion file, then you need to mention the attribute name and the ID format. But for now, we are taking this name identifier and element of the subject statement. We have two methods for this binding. So We're going to select the post one, which is like more secured, you can say. And the rest one, I think we'll keep as it is. And also there is something like just-in-time user provision. This is something that I'll take a different session and will explain you. But for now, I'll just give you an idea that whenever the authentication is done at the identity provider side, then that user information is sent to the service provider side. And service provider will going to check the user information in its own database. And if it is there, then it will going to allow the user to access the service provider. But in case if the user doesn't exist in the service provider, it will give you an error, like the user doesn't exist. But if you have some requirement like if there is no user, then you need to create it automatically in Salesforce. Then for such kind of requirement, we have just-in-time user provisioning. So for more details, we will going to discuss that in a separate session. But for now, I'll just give some information that what this parameter is all about. So I'll try to save this first of all. Okay, it's asking definitely interest. Yeah. So we have set the information for the identity provider. And once we set that, what we got is really important. The first one is the login URL. Now this is something which will behave as your ACS URL. Like we discussed that the identity provider once authenticate the user will going to send the Saml response to the service provider, and the URL where it will going to redirect that is what the ACS URL is. And this is what the ACS URL. So we got this ACS URL. Now we will move to the identity provider and try to create a connected app. For this, I'll go to the app manager. And create a new connected app. Name it as, what you can say, Salesforce Service Provider app. Contact email. And now here, first of all, you have to enable the Saml for this connected app. Now here you can see, first of all, it is asking you for the entity ID and the ACS URL. So if I'll go to the service provider settings, here is the entity ID. So I'll just copy this, paste it here. The second one is the ACS URL. Now, this is what we have discussed. Now, if you can read the note that indicates whether the service provider requires the username, a federation ID, a user ID, the value of a custom feed on a user, or a persistent ID. So ask your SP, that is service provider, which one they require. So now, as we have declared there that we require a federation ID, I declare here as federation ID. So now the subject type will going to send the federation ID to the service provider in the assertion file. So once that assertion file is received by the service provider, it will get that federation ID from the subject and matches the federation ID in its own database. So this is the essence of subject type that we have discussed earlier. Now we have the issuer. We have generated a certificate, which is this one. Now, so I think, yeah, this one is also there, that verify request signature. So while we were discussing that what are the required information from the service provider, so we discussed that we require a certificate in case if there is an encryption while a SAML request has been made. Then for that, we have to enable this and upload this certificate, which we will get from the service provider. But for now, we are not doing this for the sake of simplicity in this demo. Then I think the rest of the things are all right. There is nothing that we need to do here. Everything is okay. So I just need to save this. So now your connected app has been saved. So the only one setting that we need to add to this connected app is attach this connected app to a profile, which we can enable this by going to the manage page, and here we have the option of profiles. So I have already added this app to the system administration profile, but you can go to the manage profile page, and here you can select whatever the profile you want, but I have just selected the system administrator and have this application for this profile. So now all of the things that we require from identity provider is completed. Now, if I go to my service provider organization, so we have the single sign-on setting that we have already done. This is the name that we have given for our identity provider setting, which is identity provider org, which is something that will be visible in the login page. So before moving to that section, first of all, we need to enable this by going in the my domain section. And here at the bottom, we have option for authentication configuration. So just edit this section. And here you can see that we have that name here that we have defined for our identity provider. So we just need to enable this and save it. Yeah, so all of the configuration that we require for a service provider and identity provider is completed. Now, the only one thing that you need to make sure is that one user should be common between these two org to make the authentication work. So in my service provider org and here in my identity provider org, just first of all go to the users. So in the service provider, I'm taking myself here. What you need to do is, if you notice, I'll just first of all edit this user. And here, if you can see that we have the federation ID that we have declared in our setting, that the SAML will going to expect this federation ID and it will going to match the federation ID of the user, which is a standard, you can say, for SAML. So for now, I just add a random ID like this one and save it. For identity provider as well, I have this user here, edit this, save it. So you might have one question here that these two users and their username are different. Then how like these two users are same when we will going to authenticate them? But the reason is the same, like we are using the federation ID, not the username. So it will going to match the federation ID of the users rather than the username. But in case if you want to have username as your, you can say, use for your SAML authentication, then this is something that you can define in your configuration while we are setting up for the SAML. So now we have our users ready for testing. So first of all, what I do is I'll just log out from my identity provider. All right. Also from my service provider. Yep. So you can see on the login page, we have identity provider org. That's our identity provider name that we have mentioned. So if I click on that, it will going to redirect me to my identity provider org, where I just need to write the username and password, which is going to authenticate the user. So I have this user for my identity org. We're going to log in this. And as you can see, we are able to log into our service provider organization using our identity provider credentials. So this is how basically we can set up single sign-on, where we are using Salesforce only for our identity provider and service provider. So in the next session, we will going to use Google as our identity provider and Salesforce as our service provider, so that you can have that experience as well, that whenever you have a third-party application for identity provider, then how we will going to integrate that with our Salesforce organization.